I am Vincent Cross, 67 years old, and my son Cameron died in a yacht fire 15 years ago. Everyone said he was gone forever, swallowed by the Atlantic. For a decade and a half, I believed them. But at 3 in the morning today, my phone lit up with his old number. A voice whispered, "Dad, I am at the harbor. Please help me." I froze. But when I got there, I realized the people sharing your roof can be deadlier than the ocean. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart family members who desperately underestimated you. The ring of the landline shattered the dead silence of my bedroom. At 3 in the morning, a phone call never brings good news. I reached across the empty space on the mattress, my joints stiff from the sudden movement, and grabbed the receiver from the nightstand. The illuminated digital display on the base unit made my blood run cold. It showed a 10-digit sequence I had committed to memory, a number the phone company had permanently disconnected a decade and a half ago. It was Cameron's cell phone number. I pressed the cold plastic to my ear. For a second, there was only the sound of heavy static and the rhythmic crashing of waves in the background. Then a voice cut through the interference. "Dad, I am at the harbor. Please help me." The pitch, the slight hesitation before the word "Dad," the desperate cadence, it was exactly him. It was the voice of a 25-year-old boy who was supposed to be ashes at the bottom of the ocean. The line went dead. The dial tone buzzed flatly against my ear. I did not stop to think about the impossibility of the situation. A father does not rationalize when his child calls for help. I threw off the heavy quilt, shoved my feet into a pair of worn leather boots, and grabbed my heavy raincoat from the hallway hook. The drive to the coastal docks was a blur of slapping windshield wipers and blinding sheets of rain. I pushed my truck well over the speed limit, my hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. Pier 4 was a desolate stretch of commercial concrete and rusted shipping containers. I slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding on the slick pavement. I jumped out into the freezing downpour, leaving the engine running and the headlights cutting through the darkness. I scanned the empty docks. There was no boat. There was no silhouette hiding between the stacked crates. There was no Cameron. Instead, the harsh glare of red and blue emergency lights flooded the pier. An ambulance sat idling near the harbor master's office. 2 paramedics stepped out into the rain, pulling a thermal blanket from the back. Behind them, stepping out from the shadows of a large shipping container, were my stepson Leo and his wife Melanie. They did not look surprised to see me. They looked prepared. Leo hurried toward the paramedics, shaking his head with a practiced look of profound tragedy. He pointed directly at me. "He is having another episode," Leo said loudly, ensuring the emergency workers heard every syllable over the storm. "His dementia is getting worse by the day. He wanders out here in the middle of the night looking for my dead stepbrother. He thinks Cameron is still coming back from the fire." Melanie approached the ambulance driver, placing a manicured hand over her chest. "It is breaking our hearts to watch his mind deteriorate like this," she added, her voice trembling with perfect theatrical precision. "He is a danger to himself. We tracked his truck on the GPS because we were terrified he might drive straight into the water." The icy rain soaking through my coat suddenly felt entirely insignificant compared to the freezing realization settling in my chest. There was no ghost. There was no miraculous survival. The phone call had been a carefully engineered piece of bait. They had used an audio spoof exploiting my deepest grief to lure me to a dangerous location in the middle of the night. I looked at the paramedics observing me with deep professional pity. I saw the clipboard in the lead EMT's hand. They were filling out a psychiatric evaluation form. If I screamed, if I told them my stepson had faked a phone call from a dead man, they would check the box for severe paranoia. They would strap me to the gurney. They would place me under an involuntary 72-hour psychiatric hold. Leo would use that medical record to immediately file for a permanent conservatorship, seizing absolute control over my logistics company and my entire estate. The trap was brilliant. It was flawless. and it required me to make a choice in a fraction of a second. I let my shoulders slump. I relaxed my jaw and allowed my eyes to glaze over with forced confusion. I pulled my jet coat tighter around my chest and let out a long, shaky breath. "Where is the boat?" I mumbled, staring blankly at the dark water. He said he was at the harbor. The lead paramedic stepped forward, wrapping the thick thermal blanket over my shoulders. "It is all right, Mr. Cross. Let us get you out of the cold. Your family is right here to take you home." I allowed them to guide me away from the water. I shuffled my feet, adopting the hesitant gait of a broken, senile old man. Leo stepped up to take my arm, his grip tight and completely devoid of warmth. "We are taking over from here," Leo told the paramedics, flashing them a grateful, exhausted smile. "Thank you for coming out. We will schedule a full neurological evaluation with his primary care physician first thing tomorrow morning. We just need to get him safe and medicated for the night." The paramedics nodded, satisfied that the situation was under control. They climbed back into their vehicle and pulled away, the siren remaining silent. Melanie walked ahead toward their luxury SUV, pulling her designer hood over her head to protect her hair from the rain. Leo kept his firm grip on my biceps, steering me toward the passenger side. Right before we reached the vehicle, Leo stopped. He glanced toward a narrow alleyway between two rusted storage units. A figure in a yellow rain slicker stepped out from the darkness. It was a local dock worker, a man I recognized from the freight loading shifts. Leo shoved me roughly against the side of the SUV. "Stay right here, old man," he muttered, dropping the facade instantly. I kept my head bowed, my chin resting against my chest, but my eyes tracked his every movement. Leo walked over to the dock worker. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick envelope of cash. He shoved the money into the worker's hand. In exchange, the man handed Leo a small, cheap burner phone. The exact phone used to route the spoofed audio call. "Make sure the audio files are permanently wiped from your server," Leo instructed the man in a low, sharp tone. "If anyone traces that signal back to this pier, you will be joining his kid at the bottom of the ocean." The dock worker nodded, pocketing the cash, and disappeared back into the rainy alley. Leo returned to the car, slipping the burner phone into his interior jacket pocket. He opened the passenger door and shoved me inside. Melanie was already in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel with tense, impatient hands. "That went perfectly," Melanie said, glancing at Leo as he climbed into the back seat. "The EMTs documented the wandering and the delusions. We have the legal justification we need. Tomorrow we lock him in the guest wing and bring the doctor to him." Leo leaned forward, resting his arms on the center console. He stared at the back of my head. "He thinks he is so smart, hoarding the company assets while we drown in debt. By Friday, a judge will hand me the keys to the entire empire. He will not even be allowed to sign a check without my permission." The silence in the vehicle was thick, suffocating. Melanie adjusted the rearview mirror, her eyes briefly locking onto mine before she looked away in disgust. They had clearly spent months planning this operation. They had mapped out my vulnerabilities, betting that a father's enduring sorrow would override his logic. They were right about the sorrow, but critically wrong about my logic. I was not a fragile senior citizen crumbling under the weight of memory. I was the founder of a marine logistics empire, a man who had spent 40 years anticipating betrayals from corporate sharks. Leo was an amateur playing a professional's game. I stared out the rain-streaked window as the SUV pulled away from the harbor. I did not speak. I did not defend myself. I let them believe they had successfully neutralized a helpless, declining old man. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They thought they were bringing a prisoner back to his own home to await his legal execution. They did not realize they had just handed me the exact map of their entire conspiracy. I knew what they wanted. I knew how they planned to get it. And most importantly, I knew the physical location of the evidence that could destroy them. The burner phone in Leo's pocket held the digital footprint of their fraud. It held the connection to the offshore routing they had used to fake Cameron's voice. I needed that device. I needed it before sunrise. The vehicle turned onto the highway leading back to my estate. I closed my eyes, steadying my breathing. The grief of hearing my dead son's voice had vanished entirely, replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. Tomorrow morning they would attempt to cage me in my own home under the guise of medical observation. They expected me to panic. They expected me to fight the doctors and prove their narrative correct. Instead, I was going to use their own prison against them. I was going to secure that burner phone, and I was going to rip their lives apart piece by piece, starting with the very foundation they thought they had just conquered. The heavy brass lock clicked into place with a definitive thud. I stood in the center of the guest bedroom, listening to the sound of retreating footsteps. The solid mahogany door remained firmly shut. I turned the brass knob to confirm the obvious reality. It was deadbolted from the outside. Leo had trapped me in the east wing of my own house under the guise of medical observation. I did not strike the wood. I did not raise my voice to demand an explanation. Panic is a luxury afforded only to those who do not understand their enemy. I dropped to my knees and pressed my ear against the polished hardwood floor. The architectural layout of this estate included a central ventilation shaft connecting the east wing directly to the downstairs study. I crawled toward the cast iron floor register near the baseboard. I pressed my face against the cold metal grill. The voices drifting up from the study were clear and sharp. Leo was pacing rapidly. His leather shoes clicked rhythmically against the slate tile. He was speaking to Melanie about cross-marine logistics. He detailed a structured buyout from a rival shipping conglomerate. He stated that he needed my signature to finalize the asset transfer before the end of the fiscal quarter. Melanie told him the buyer was losing patience. She said they needed the medical power of attorney enacted by noon today to force the sale. I heard the study door open and close. Footsteps approached the main staircase. I moved away from the vent and sat on the edge of the mattress. A shadow blocked the light beneath my bedroom door. A thick stack of stapled documents slid across the floorboards. Melanie spoke through the solid wood. She told me to sign the conservatorship papers for my own good. She claimed the doctor was arriving in 2 hours to finalize the psychiatric evaluation and commit me to a specialized facility. I stared at the legal documents resting on the rug. The top page granted Leo absolute control over my medical and financial decisions. I kept my voice weak and trembling to maintain my facade. I told Melanie I needed time to read the complex paragraphs. I told her my eyes were tired and my reading glasses were downstairs. She scoffed softly. She said I had exactly 1 hour to review the papers before Leo came upstairs to assist me with the pen. Her footsteps retreated down the hallway. I had exactly 60 minutes to alter the balance of power. I retrieved a flathead screwdriver from the small repair kit I kept inside the bedside table drawer. I returned to the floor register and swiftly removed the 4 corner screws. I lifted the heavy iron grill and set it aside. The ventilation duct was narrow but navigable. I had retrofitted this exact HVAC system 15 years ago to improve the air circulation in Cameron's old bedroom. I knew every turn and joint in the galvanized steel. I lowered myself feet first into the dark shaft. The metal groaned slightly under my weight. I navigated the rusted interior of the ventilation shaft with slow, deliberate movements. My boots scraped against the galvanized steel as I shimmied downward. The air grew stale and heavy with the scent of old insulation. I reached the lower junction box and paused to steady my breathing. I braced my shoulders against the narrow walls and descended toward the ground floor. The accumulated dust coated my clothes and made my eyes water. I ignored the burning sensation in my shoulder joints. I reached the horizontal junction that directed airflow toward the exterior exhaust. I kicked the thin aluminum barrier outward. The metal gave way with a muted snap. I tumbled forward into the damp soil of the side garden. The freezing rain immediately soaked through my shirt. I stayed low to the ground, using the dense row of hydrangea bushes as cover. I bypassed the motion sensor floodlights I had purposely disabled months ago for maintenance. I reached the wrought iron side gate and slipped through the gap. I stepped onto the slick pavement of the street. I pulled the hood of my raincoat over my head and walked briskly toward the industrial district. My target was a dilapidated tavern sitting on the edge of the commercial docks. The neon sign outside the tavern buzzed erratically in the storm. I pushed open the heavy wooden door. The smell of stale beer and damp wool filled the room. The tavern was mostly empty save for a few night shift harbor workers. I spotted Jonah sitting in a secluded booth near the back exit. He was nursing a dark rum and counting a stack of damp bills. They were the exact same bills Leo had handed him at the pier just hours ago. I slid into the booth opposite him. Jonah reached into his jacket immediately. His eyes darted toward the exit. I placed both hands flat on the sticky tabletop. I told him to keep his hands perfectly visible. I recited the exact registry numbers of 3 shipping containers currently sitting in Sector 4 of my shipyard. I explained that those specific containers bypassed customs inspections due to a security blind spot I purposely ignored to monitor internal theft. I told Jonah I knew he used those containers to funnel untaxed electronics across the border. I informed him that a single phone call to the Port Authority would trigger a federal raid on his entire smuggling operation. The color drained from his weathered face. He stopped reaching into his jacket. I did not ask for the money. I demanded the burner phone Leo had given him. Jonah stared at me with pure hatred. He pulled the cheap plastic device from his pocket and slid it across the table. He told me I was making a massive mistake crossing his associates. I ignored his threat entirely. I pocketed the phone and stood up. I walked out of the tavern into the relentless rain. I needed a secure environment to examine the device away from Leo's surveillance network. I walked 3 blocks to a 24-hour diner and ordered a black coffee. I sat in a brightly lit corner booth facing the entrance. I placed the burner phone on the Formica table. I connected the device to my encrypted mobile router using a specialized diagnostic cable I kept in my coat pocket. I booted up the diagnostic software on my secure tablet. The phone was entirely wiped of standard consumer data. Leo had attempted to scrub the device, but he lacked the technical expertise to erase the deep system cache. I bypassed the rudimentary firewall and accessed the raw communication logs. I isolated the origin data for the phantom phone call. The call did not originate from a local cell tower. The software had not used a synthetic voice generator or an artificial intelligence deepfake. The frequency signature was entirely authentic. The call had been routed through a commercial satellite hovering over the Caribbean. I dug deeper into the hidden application folders on the burner device. I uncovered an encrypted banking application running silently in the background. The thick layers of encryption masking the banking application required a localized brute force sequence. I monitored the progress bar on my tablet as the algorithm chewed through Leo's pathetic security measures. The decryption finalized with a soft chime. The screen illuminated with a series of offshore transaction alerts. Leo was siphoning capital from cross-marine logistics. He was moving thousands of dollars every week into a shell account located in the Cayman Islands. I checked the primary beneficiary listed on the shell account. The name on the digital ledger was Cameron Cross. The reality of the data struck me like a physical blow to the chest. The call was real. My son was alive. Leo was not just embezzling corporate money. He was funneling my corporate funds to track down Cameron across international waters. The mourning period of the past 15 years had been a fabricated nightmare. Leo knew Cameron had survived the yacht fire, and he was currently hunting him to finish the job. I disconnected the burner phone and placed it securely in my pocket. The parameters of my survival had instantly shifted from a corporate defense to a lethal rescue mission. I reached the edge of my estate just as the deep purple of false dawn stained the horizon. The rain had softened to a steady drizzle. I bypassed the main gate and moved through the dense line of bushes bordering the property. The side garden access panel was exactly where I left it. I slid into the ventilation shaft and pulled the aluminum grate back into place before inching my way upward. My muscles screamed in protest against the confined space. I hoisted myself through the floor register in the guest room and quietly screwed the iron grill down. I stripped off my soaked clothes and hid the burner phone beneath a loose floorboard under the bed before slipping under the heavy covers. Less than 20 minutes later, the brass lock clicked. The door swung open. Leo stood in the doorway holding a cup of coffee. He studied my face while searching for any sign of lucidity. I let my jaw hang slack and stared blankly at the far wall. I asked him what time the boat was arriving. Disgust flashed across his features. He muttered that breakfast would be ready soon and locked the door again. My performance had worked perfectly. I had bought myself the exact window of freedom I needed for the evening. The annual logistics gala was held in the grand ballroom of the downtown plaza the very next evening. Leo had spared no expense using company funds to secure the venue. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over 50 circular tables draped in white silk. Industry leaders and rival shipping executives filled the room. Melanie guided me by the elbow toward the head table. She wore a stunning sapphire gown and played the role of the devoted caregiver with sickening perfection. She whispered to a passing board member about how difficult my sudden mental decline had been on their marriage. I shuffled my feet and hunched my shoulders while keeping my eyes fixed on the patterned carpet. People parted for me with a mixture of reverence and deep pity. I sat in my designated chair and offered weak, vacant smiles to the men and women I had done business with for 3 decades. They saw a pioneer fading into senility. They had no idea I was mapping the security layout of the building. The executive suites were located 3 floors above us and were accessible only by a private elevator that required a biometric scan or a master override keycard. I watched Leo work the room. He was shaking hands and laughing while exuding absolute confidence. He truly believed the empire was already his. He believed the conservatorship papers sitting on his desk at home were merely a formality. The clinking of silverware against porcelain faded as Leo tapped a spoon against his crystal champagne flute. He stepped up to the main podium. The spotlight hit his face. He adjusted his tailored suit jacket and smiled warmly at the crowd. He began a deeply emotional speech about legacy and duty and the tragic inevitability of time. He pointed directly at me while his voice cracked with artificial sorrow. He announced that my failing health had forced me to step down from the operational helm of Cross Marine Logistics. He declared that he would be assuming the role of Chief Executive Officer effective Monday morning to preserve my life work. The ballroom erupted in supportive applause. Melanie dabbed at her dry eyes with a linen napkin. I let a trembling hand reach up to wipe my own face to complete the illusion. The crowd gave a standing ovation to the loyal stepson taking up the mantle. While all eyes were fixed on Leo at the podium, I leaned over to Melanie. I mumbled that I needed to use the restroom and felt terribly fatigued. She nodded dismissively, since her attention was entirely captivated by her husband taking his victory lap. She signaled a young security guard to escort me to the lobby doors. Once we reached the marble corridor outside the ballroom, I waved the guard off and insisted I needed a moment of privacy. The moment the guard turned the corner, my posture straightened. The tremor in my hands vanished completely. I moved with swift and silent purpose toward the private elevator bank. I pulled a cloned magnetic keycard from my breast pocket. I had procured it from the head of building maintenance 3 years ago during a corporate lease negotiation. I swiped the card. The heavy metal doors parted. I pressed the button for the executive floor. The ride felt agonizingly slow. The elevator chimed softly as it arrived. The corridor was completely deserted. The thick carpets muffled my footsteps as I approached the temporary gala office Leo was using. The heavy oak door was locked with a digital keypad. Leo was arrogant, but he was also completely predictable. He used the date of his mother passing as his primary passcode for everything. I punched in the 6 digits. The green light flashed. I stepped inside and locked the door behind me. The room was dark, and illuminated only by the glow of the city skyline through the massive windows. I approached the sleek desktop terminal resting on the glass table. Leo had logged out and secured the network behind a biometric firewall. I bypassed the standard login screen entirely. I pulled a compact storage drive from my inner pocket and inserted it into the hidden diagnostic port at the back of the machine. 10 years ago, when I upgraded the company digital infrastructure, I buried a master administrative backdoor code into the core architecture. It was a fail-safe protocol meant to protect the firm from hostile digital takeovers. I never told anyone about it. I typed a string of command prompts into the black terminal window. The biometric lock dissolved instantly. I was inside the mainframe with unrestricted global access. I navigated directly to the restricted financial directories. I initiated a bulk download of the private ledgers Leo had hidden from the board of directors. The progress bar crawled across the screen. 50%. 70%. Every second felt like an hour. Downstairs, the applause would be ending. The dessert course would be served. Melanie would realize I had been gone too long. 90%. The download completed with a soft click. I safely ejected the drive and erased the access log before restoring the biometric lock screen. I left the office exactly as I found it. I took the stairs down to the mezzanine level to avoid the elevator cameras. I stepped into a private restroom and splashed cold water on my face. I resumed my hunched and defeated posture before walking back into the ballroom. Later that night, secure in the darkness of my locked bedroom, I plugged the storage drive into my secure tablet. I opened the decrypted ledgers. I expected to find standard corporate embezzlement. I expected to see padded expense accounts and money diverted to personal offshore trusts. What I found was infinitely more terrifying. Leo was not just stealing company revenue. He was receiving massive regular wire transfers from phantom corporations based in Eastern Europe and South America. He was routing those funds through our shipping manifests and using fake cargo registries to clean the money. He was washing tens of millions of dollars through my legitimate enterprise and dispersing the clean cash into untraceable shell accounts. I cross-referenced the routing numbers with a global watchdog database I had access to. The phantom corporations belonged to a highly dangerous international syndicate. Leo was functioning as a primary launderer for a violent criminal empire. My blood ran cold as the lethal implications washed over me. I had planned to trigger my veto power tomorrow to freeze every single corporate asset. I had planned to cut off his money supply to force a surrender. But these ledgers changed the entire battlefield. If I froze those accounts, the syndicate money would be trapped. They would not take Leo to court. They would simply execute him. And they would not stop there. They would eliminate anyone connected to the frozen accounts to recover their capital. If I pulled the trigger on the asset freeze now, I would be signing a death warrant for Leo and for myself and for Cameron. My son was out there right now alive and hiding from this exact threat. I had to find a way to extract Cameron and dismantle this syndicate connection before shutting down the company. The trap I had built for my stepson had just become a lethal minefield. Sylvia adjusted her thick-rimmed glasses and slid the decrypted ledgers back across the polished steel table. The private vault deep beneath the financial district was soundproof and climate-controlled. The air smelled faintly of ozone and expensive cologne. She had been my private wealth manager for 2 decades. She was a woman who navigated corporate warfare with the precision of a seasoned predator. Sylvia tapped a manicured fingernail against the digital display of her tablet. She stated the numbers with terrifying clarity. Leo had moved $30 million in syndicate funds through the company over the past 18 months. He had used ghost shipments of marine equipment to disguise the transactions. Sylvia crossed her arms and leaned back in her leather chair. She looked at me with cold, professional assessment. She informed me that Leo had already scheduled the final corporate sale for Friday morning. He had convinced the buyers that my mental decline was absolute. He only needed my signature on the conservatorship papers to execute the final transfer of control. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the original articles of incorporation for Cross Marine Logistics. I laid the yellowed parchment flat on the table between us. I instructed Sylvia to execute the contingency plan we had drafted 10 years ago. I still retained 51% voting control of the company assets. Leo held operational authority, but he lacked the fundamental ownership of the patents and the physical fleet. I ordered Sylvia to immediately initiate an irrevocable blind trust. I wanted every liquid asset, every shipping contract, and every intellectual property patent transferred into that trust before the stock market opened. I dictated that the trust would require dual authorization to access: my signature and Cameron's signature. Sylvia's eyes widened slightly at the mention of my son. I confirmed to her that Cameron was alive and that Leo was using company funds to hunt him down. Sylvia did not waste time with unnecessary questions. She pulled her encrypted laptop from her briefcase and began typing with rapid precision. She navigated the complex banking networks with practiced ease. Within minutes, she had generated the transfer protocols. She slid a thick stack of transfer documents toward me. I signed my name with a steady hand. I watched the ink dry on the paper, knowing I was effectively vaporizing Leo's entire empire with a few strokes of a pen. Sylvia finalized the digital authorization. The screen flashed green. The asset transfer was complete. Cross Marine Logistics was now an empty shell. The company possessed zero liquid capital and zero operational assets. The entire infrastructure was barricaded behind the impenetrable walls of the blind trust. Sylvia initiated the secondary phase of the operation. She accessed the corporate banking portals. She systematically revoked Leo's executive credit lines. She canceled his corporate cards and nullified his signature authority on all company accounts. She set a digital tripwire within the banking system. The moment Leo attempted to finalize the sale of the company to the rival conglomerate, the system would immediately trigger a total lockdown. It would flag the transaction as fraudulent and freeze all remaining operational funds. Leo would be left completely paralyzed. He would have no access to the company money and no ability to move the syndicate funds he was laundering. Sylvia closed her laptop and looked at me with a grave expression. She had executed my orders perfectly, but she understood the terrifying implications of our actions. She leaned forward and lowered her voice. She warned me that cornering a man like Leo was incredibly dangerous. He was deeply embedded with a violent international syndicate. He owed them money, and he had promised them a clean laundering operation. By freezing the accounts, I had effectively severed his lifeline. The syndicate would not accept excuses. They would demand their money. Leo would be desperate. He would realize instantly that the conservatorship papers were useless. He would understand that he needed my physical signature to break the blind trust and release the funds. Sylvia warned me that Leo would abandon his careful manipulation. He would resort to extreme physical violence to force my compliance. He would torture me if necessary to get what he wanted. I thanked Sylvia for her discretion and her speed. I stood up from the table and gathered my coat. I assured her that I was fully aware of the consequences. I had spent 15 years mourning a son I thought I had lost to the sea. I was not going to let the man responsible for that grief dictate the terms of our final confrontation. I told Sylvia to monitor the accounts and contact me the moment Leo triggered the tripwire. I left the secured vault and walked out into the busy downtown streets. The morning rush hour had begun. People hurried past me with coffees and briefcases. They had no idea that a quiet war had just been waged beneath their feet. I needed to return to the estate before Leo realized his financial empire had collapsed. I caught a cab and rode back to the suburbs. I slipped through the side garden gate and navigated the ventilation shaft back to the guest room. I locked the floor register and crawled into bed just as I heard heavy footsteps approaching my door. The brass lock turned. Leo stepped into the room holding a breakfast tray. He looked exhausted. He had dark circles under his eyes and his suit was slightly wrinkled. He had clearly spent the night finalizing the details of his corporate sale. He set the tray on the nightstand and looked at me with thinly veiled contempt. He asked if I had reviewed the conservatorship papers. I stared at him with a blank expression. I mumbled that I could not read the small print. I asked him again when Cameron was coming home. Leo clenched his jaw and turned away. He told me the doctor would be arriving soon to handle everything. He left the room and locked the door behind him. I sat up in bed and waited. I knew it was only a matter of time before the digital tripwire was triggered. I knew Leo was about to discover that his perfect plan had been entirely dismantled. I prepared myself for the violence that was sure to follow. I was ready. I sat in the high-backed leather armchair of my study waiting for the digital tripwire to snap. The heavy oak doors were tightly closed to shut out the gray morning light. On the polished mahogany desk, my secure tablet glowed with real-time banking analytics. Sylvia had promised an immediate notification the moment the corporate accounts registered an unauthorized draw. The tablet chimed a sharp, singular note that cut through the silence of the estate. I checked the high-resolution screen. A transaction attempt for $150,000 at a luxury European auto dealership downtown had just registered against the primary executive card. The screen flashed bright red to display a status code indicating a hard decline due to frozen assets. A second attempt triggered exactly 10 seconds later. Declined. A third attempt followed almost immediately. Declined. The trap had effectively slammed shut. Melanie was attempting to reward herself for her successful performance at the gala last night by purchasing a high-performance sports car using company funds. She believed the empire was fully under her husband's operational control. She had no idea the accounts were completely barricaded behind my blind trust. I closed the tablet and slid it into the top drawer alongside a freshly printed legal dossier. I poured myself a single glass of water and waited for the inevitable explosion. It took exactly 45 minutes for the front door of the estate to slam open, with enough violent force to rattle the antique window panes. High heels clicked furiously across the marble foyer, echoing like gunfire through the silent house. I remained seated in the dim study, arranging a thick manila envelope perfectly in the center of the leather blotter. The double doors flew open and crashed against the interior walls. Melanie stood in the doorway, breathing heavily. Her designer coat was draped haphazardly over one arm. Her face was flushed with absolute rage. She marched straight toward my desk, tossing her expensive handbag onto the leather sofa with a loud thud. She leaned over the mahogany surface and slammed both hands down. She began screaming about the profound humiliation she just endured at the dealership. She weaponized my fabricated illness instantly. She yelled that my worsening senility was destroying their lives. She claimed my diseased mind had forgotten to authorize the monthly capital transfers to the corporate credit lines. She called me a pathetic burden who could not even remember to pay the basic operational bills. I did not flinch. I did not offer the confused, trembling apology she expected. I took a slow, deliberate sip of water and set the glass down. The sheer volume of her voice began to crack under the weight of my absolute silence. Her rant slowed to a halt. She stared at me, waiting for the frightened old man to surface. I unclasped my hands and reached for the manila envelope. I pulled out a 20-page forensic financial report Sylvia had prepared for me weeks ago. I slid the thick document across the smooth wood until it rested directly beneath Melanie's trembling fingers. I spoke in a clear, resonant tone, entirely devoid of the frailty I had projected for the past few days. I told her to look at page 7. The sudden shift in my demeanor paralyzed her. She hesitated before flipping the heavy cardstock cover. Her eyes scanned the highlighted paragraphs. The document detailed a massive unauthorized corporate loan taken out against the company pension fund exactly 8 months prior. The signature on the authorization line was a perfect forgery of my own handwriting. I explained the mechanics of the crime with cold precision. I detailed how she had practiced my signature on discarded legal pads we recovered from the recycling bin. I pointed out the digital timestamps, proving the loan was wired directly into a private shell account registered under her maiden name. I informed her that the penalty for defrauding a corporate pension fund and executing federal wire fraud carried a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years in a federal penitentiary. The color drained from her face completely. Her arrogant posture collapsed. She stumbled backward and grasped the edge of the chair for support. She realized I was not a senile victim. She realized she was staring at the architect of her absolute destruction. Panic consumed her entirely. The facade of the loyal, devoted wife shattered into a million jagged pieces. Melanie began to hyperventilate while shaking her head violently. She pointed a trembling finger toward the hallway and blamed Leo for the entire illegal operation. She screamed that she would not go to prison for his arrogant mistakes. She shrieked that the loan was his idea to cover the initial syndicate debts before they could force the corporate sale. She paced frantically around the room, pulling at her hair and demanding I call the lawyers to strike a deal. I remained perfectly still and let her terror loosen her tongue. Desperation makes people reckless, and Melanie was drowning in it. She yelled that she knew enough to bury Leo forever. She swore she would hand him over to the federal authorities in exchange for her own prosecutorial immunity. Her voice reached a hysterical pitch as she began listing his hidden sins. She bragged about knowing his private security codes and his off-the-book accounts. Then she made the fatal slip. She screamed that she knew about the downtown safe deposit box, where he kept his sick trophies. She ranted that Leo was arrogant enough to keep physical souvenirs from the Atlantic yacht fire 15 years ago. She said he kept charred belongings from that night locked in a steel box to remind himself of his ultimate victory over Cameron. The mention of the yacht fire hit me with the force of a runaway freight train. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs, but I kept my facial muscles entirely rigid. The pieces of the puzzle aligned with terrifying clarity. Leo had not just planned to steal the logistics company. He had orchestrated the horrific fire that supposedly killed my son. He had kept physical proof of his crime locked away in a downtown bank vault for a decade and a half. The phantom phone call at 3 a.m. was not a cruel digital prank. It was a genuine, desperate plea from a son who had spent 15 years hiding from his own murderous stepbrother. Melanie stood weeping in the center of my study, entirely unaware of the massive intelligence she had just handed me. She begged me to spare her. She offered to testify against Leo in federal court tomorrow. I stood up from the desk. I ignored her dramatic tears completely. I instructed her to remain in the house and wait for my instructions if she wished to avoid an immediate federal indictment. I walked past her sobbing form and headed straight for the front door. The corporate war over financial assets was effectively over. The battle for my son's life had just truly begun. I needed to access that secure deposit box before Leo realized his panicked wife had betrayed him. I needed to find the physical evidence of his 15-year-old crime, and I needed to find Cameron. The heavy grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 10 times. I sat at the head of the long mahogany dining table, resting my hands flat against the polished wood. The rain from the previous night had finally stopped, leaving a thick, suffocating humidity in the air. I knew exactly what was about to walk through my front door. Leo was a creature of absolute predictability. When you strip a predator of its financial claws, it does not retreat. It lashes out with whatever desperate tools it has left. His corporate credit was frozen. His lease was effectively nullified. His syndicate handlers were undoubtedly breathing down his neck for their laundered cash. He needed my physical signature on those conservatorship documents today, or he was a dead man. I was not alone in the dining room. Sitting quietly to my right was Wallace, my personal attorney, for over 2 decades. Wallace was a man who spoke softly, but carried the legal equivalent of a sledgehammer. Across from him sat an older woman with sharp, observing eyes. Her name was Evelyn, a senior investigator for the State Medical Board. I had called Wallace before dawn, laying out the precise sequence of events that had transpired over the last 24 hours. I told him about the spoofed phone call at the harbor and the fake dementia narrative Leo was building. Wallace had immediately pulled Evelyn into our circle. They were both sipping black coffee, completely silent, waiting for the trap to spring. The sound of tires screeching onto the gravel driveway echoed through the quiet estate. Heavy footsteps pounded up the front porch steps. A key rattled violently in the lock. Leo had kept his copy of the house key, confident that I was too senile to change the locks. The heavy oak door swung open with a loud crash. I remained perfectly still, adopting the fragile, stooped posture I had perfected over the past 2 days. I let my hands tremble slightly on the table. Leo stormed into the dining room. He looked absolutely unhinged. The arrogant, polished executive from the gala was gone. His tie was loosened, his hair was disheveled, and his eyes were wide with pure panic. Trailing closely behind him was a man I had never seen before. The stranger wore an ill-fitting suit and carried a worn leather briefcase. He had the nervous, shifty demeanor of a man who operated entirely in the shadows. He did not look like a medical professional. He looked like a hired thug wearing a stethoscope. Leo slammed a thick stack of papers onto the dining table right in front of me. He leaned over, planting both hands on the wood, trapping me in my chair. He did not bother with pleasantries. He did not pretend to care about my health. He dropped a silver pen on top of the documents. "You are going to sign this right now." Leo hissed, his breath smelling of stale coffee and fear. "Your mind is gone, old man. You are hallucinating. You locked the bank accounts by mistake. You triggered a security freeze because your brain is rotting. I brought Dr. Aris to conduct your final evaluation. He is going to certify that you are a danger to yourself and others. If you do not sign this medical power of attorney right now, he is calling the authorities to have you dragged out of here in a straitjacket." The man introduced as Dr. Aris stepped forward, opening his briefcase. He pulled out a pre-filled psychiatric evaluation form. He did not ask me a single medical question. He did not check my pulse or look into my eyes. He simply placed a clipboard next to the conservatorship papers and tapped the bottom line. "Mr. Cross," the fake doctor said in a slick, practiced voice, "your stepson has detailed your severe cognitive decline. We can do this the easy way, where you transfer control peacefully, or we can involve state custody. The choice is yours." I looked at the silver pen. I looked at the fraudulent documents. Then I slowly straightened my back. The fabricated tremor in my hands vanished. I rolled my shoulders back and looked Leo directly in the eyes. I did not reach for the pen. Instead, I gestured to the shadows at the far end of the dining room. Wallace stood up first, stepping into the morning light. Evelyn followed, pulling a small silver badge from her blazer pocket and setting it gently on the mahogany table. Leo froze. The blood drained from his face so fast he looked like a corpse. He stared at Wallace, recognizing my attorney immediately. Then his eyes darted to Evelyn and the glowing silver badge resting on the wood. "I believe this consultation is over," Wallace said, his voice slicing through the tension like a razor. "Leo, you have just brought an unlicensed fraudulent medical practitioner into this home to extort a signature from my client under duress." Evelyn stepped forward, picking up the psychiatric evaluation form the stranger had placed on the table. She examined the signature and the medical license number printed at the top. She looked at the man in the ill-fitting suit. She stated that the medical license number on the form belonged to a pediatrician who had died 3 years ago. She informed him that impersonating a licensed psychiatrist to facilitate a fraudulent conservatorship carried a minimum sentence of 10 years in state prison. She calmly pulled her cell phone from her pocket and dialed the local precinct. The fake doctor did not hesitate. He did not try to defend himself or argue his credentials. Pure terror washed over his face. He dropped his briefcase on the floor, turned on his heel, and sprinted out of the dining room. We heard his footsteps scramble across the foyer, the front door slamming shut, and the sound of his car tires tearing out of the driveway. He abandoned Leo instantly to save himself. Leo stood completely paralyzed. His ultimate weapon had just evaporated in front of his eyes. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He looked at the discarded conservatorship papers, realizing his entire scheme was dead. Wallace opened his own leather briefcase and pulled out a series of legally binding documents. He slid the first document across the table. It was a formal restraining order signed by a superior court judge just an hour ago. It legally barred Leo from coming within 500 feet of my person, my estate, and my corporate headquarters. Wallace slid a second document forward. It was a notice of immediate termination. It detailed Leo's permanent removal from the board of directors and stripped him of his title as vice president of operations. Wallace explained that Leo was no longer an employee of Cross Marine Logistics. He possessed no corporate authority, no salary, and no legal protection. Furthermore, Wallace informed him that a private forensic audit had already been submitted to the authorities regarding his unauthorized loans. "You are trespassing on private property," I told Leo, my voice cold and hollow. "You have exactly 1 minute to leave my house before Evelyn hands you over to the patrol cars currently en route." Leo stared at me. The arrogant facade was entirely gone. He looked like a cornered animal. He realized that the senile old man he thought he was hunting had actually been hunting him. He backed away from the table, his chest heaving with panicked breaths. Before he could reach the hallway, a sharp, piercing ringtone shattered the silence. It came from Leo's pocket. It was not his regular smartphone. It was a secondary encrypted device. I recognized the harsh electronic chime. It was a high-priority communication line. Leo pulled the phone out. He looked at the caller ID, and a new, much deeper shade of terror overtook his features. He forgot about Wallace. He forgot about the restraining order. He answered the call with trembling fingers and pressed the speaker to his ear. I watched him listen. He did not say a word. He just nodded slowly, his eyes wide and vacant. The color of his skin turned a sickly ashen gray. The people on the other end of that line did not care about his failed conservatorship. They did not care about his corporate termination. They were the syndicate bosses. His grace period for the laundered money was officially over. The digital tripwire Sylvia and I had set had flagged his accounts. The money he promised to clean for them was locked behind my blind trust, and they were demanding their capital immediately. Leo slowly lowered the phone. The call had disconnected. He looked at me, and the dynamic of our war shifted completely in that single moment. The corporate battle was finished. The legal threats were meaningless. Leo was a dead man walking if he did not deliver those funds by midnight. He did not yell. He did not threaten me with lawyers or doctors. He spoke with a quiet, lethal desperation that chilled the air in the room. He told me that I had no idea what I had just unleashed. He said the people he owed money to did not care about restraining orders or state investigators. He promised me that he would get the access codes to the trust, even if he had to peel them out of my mind, piece by piece. Leo turned and walked out the front door, leaving it wide open to the humid morning air. The engine of his luxury car roared to life and faded down the street. I sat silently at the mahogany table. Wallace asked if I needed him to arrange private security for the estate. I shook my head. Security guards would only become collateral damage. Leo was out of legal options and out of time. He was going to hire men who operated in the shadows. He was going to send armed enforcers to extract the money by force. My quiet adjustment had just become a war for physical survival, and I needed to reach Cameron before the violence spilled onto the coast. I left the dining room exactly as the taillights of Leo's car disappeared down the oak-lined driveway. I had no time to waste on the aftermath of his panic. Melanie had given me the precise location of the vault during her hysterical breakdown. It was a private depository located in the basement of the old Mercantile Exchange building downtown. I drove my truck through the morning traffic with singular focus. The rain had washed the streets clean, but the sky remained the color of bruised iron. I parked in the loading zone and walked directly into the grand lobby of the exchange. The bank manager sitting behind the mahogany desk was a man I had personally appointed to the advisory board 5 years ago. I did not ask for permission. I walked up to his desk and instructed him to grant me immediate access to the private sub-level vault registered under Leo's holding corporation. The manager hesitated for a fraction of a second. I reminded him that I still held the controlling shares of the parent company and that his own pension was tied to the blind trust I had just executed. He swallowed hard and stood up immediately. He guided me to the basement level and bypassed the standard security protocols using his master biometric override. He left me alone in a long corridor, lined with polished steel boxes. I stood in front of box 412. Leo used his mother's birth date for all his secure passwords and numerical codes. I punched the familiar sequence into the digital keypad adjacent to the steel door. The heavy locking mechanism clicked open with a hollow metallic echo. I pulled the drawer out and set it onto the viewing table. The interior of the metal box smelled faintly of stale seawater and burnt carbon. The scent hit the back of my throat and dragged me back 15 years in a single heartbeat. I reached inside and pulled out a small plastic evidence bag. Resting at the bottom of the transparent plastic was a charred stainless steel diving watch. The glass face was shattered and the metal band was warped from extreme heat. I turned the watch over in my palm. The initials engraved on the back casing were entirely legible. They belonged to Cameron. I had bought him that exact watch for his 21st birthday. The authorities had told me that no personal effects survived the intensity of the yacht fire. Leo had scavenged this from the wreckage before the Coast Guard arrived. He had kept it as a grotesque trophy of his ultimate victory. I set the watch aside and reached deeper into the steel drawer. My fingers brushed against a thick, leather-bound book. The edges of the pages were singed black, and the leather cover was severely blistered by fire. I recognized the gold-embossed anchor on the front immediately. It was the original captain logbook from the Atlantic voyage. The marine investigators had claimed this book was destroyed in the engine room blaze. I opened the stiff pages carefully to avoid crumbling the fragile paper. The final entries were written in Cameron's precise block handwriting. I read the paragraphs, dated 2 days before the vessel went up in flames. The text did not detail weather patterns or navigation coordinates. The pages were filled with meticulous financial calculations and corporate routing numbers. Cameron had spent the voyage cross-referencing the shipping manifests with the company ledger. He had discovered the initial embezzlement 15 years ago. He documented how Leo was siphoning initial seed money to fund a private gambling habit that had spiraled completely out of control. Cameron wrote that he planned to confront Leo the moment the yacht docked back in the harbor. He detailed his intention to turn the financial evidence over to me and demand Leo be prosecuted. The final sentence on the page stated that Leo had unexpectedly boarded the vessel at a private refueling station and insisted on joining the final leg of the journey. I traced the burnt edges of the paper with my index finger. The explosion in the engine room was not a mechanical failure caused by a faulty fuel line. The fire was a deliberate assassination. Leo had cornered my son at sea to prevent the exposure of his petty theft. He had ignited the vessel to protect himself and seize the entire corporate inheritance. The grief that had suffocated me for a decade and a half crystallized into a profound and absolute rage. The narrative of the tragic accident was entirely fabricated by a parasite sitting at my own dining table. I turned to the very back of the logbook to see if there were any remaining notes. A folded piece of glossy photographic paper slipped from between the back cover and the binding. It fluttered down and landed face up on the polished viewing table. I picked up the photograph. It was a surveillance shot taken with a long telephoto lens. The digital timestamp printed in the bottom corner indicated the picture was taken less than 48 hours ago. The image showed a battered wooden fishing cabin sitting on the edge of a rocky coastline. A man was standing on the porch, holding a bundle of heavy maritime ropes. The man had graying hair and deep weathering around his eyes. A thick, jagged burn scar traveled from his jawline down the side of his neck. Despite the physical aging and the brutal scarring, the facial structure was unmistakable. It was Cameron. He was alive. He had survived the inferno and spent 15 years hiding from the stepbrother who had tried to murder him. I stared at the details in the background of the photograph. I recognized the jagged shape of the sea stack rising from the water behind the cabin. It was a remote coastal inlet 300 miles north of the city. Leo had clearly hired a private investigator to track down the source of the recent offshore communications. The morning phone call was not a cruel deception. It was a genuine, desperate plea for help. Cameron had broken his 15-year silence because his location had been compromised. I flipped the photograph over. There was a handwritten address scrawled in black marker on the back, followed by a brief set of tactical instructions. The notes detailed the exact shift changes of the local harbor patrol and the optimal approach routes to the cabin. Leo had not just found my son. He had mapped out a tactical raid to eliminate him permanently. The syndicate creditors were demanding their laundered money by midnight, but Leo needed to tie up his loose ends first. He was sending the armed enforcers he had just hired directly to that northern inlet to finish the assassination he started 15 years ago. I placed the photograph, the logbook, and the charred watch into my coat pocket. I closed the empty steel drawer and shoved it back into the wall vault. The locking mechanism engaged with a final heavy thud. I walked out of the bank with absolute clarity of purpose. The financial maneuvering was completely irrelevant now. The conservatorship battle and the corporate asset freeze were merely distractions compared to the immediate physical threat closing in on my family. I had to reach that coastal town before the syndicate enforcers arrived. I had to pull my son from the crossfire and bring the war directly to the men Leo had unleashed. I climbed into my truck and turned the ignition. I steered the heavy vehicle toward the northbound highway, accelerating into the relentless gray morning. I parked my truck directly across the street from the soaring glass and steel architecture of the downtown residential tower. The morning commute was in full swing, but my focus remained entirely fixed on the opulent main entrance of the building. I had a long drive ahead of me to reach the northern coastal inlet, but I could not leave the city without severing the final thread of comfort my stepson possessed. Leo and Melanie lived in a sprawling penthouse suite on the 42nd floor. It was a residence funded entirely by a corporate lease agreement under the company name. They treated that penthouse as their untouchable sanctuary. They believed their domestic lives were completely insulated from the financial warfare happening in the boardroom. They were tragically mistaken. I picked up my secure tablet from the passenger seat and initiated a voice call to Wallace. My attorney was already inside the building, waiting in the ground floor management office. Wallace confirmed that the legal paperwork had been processed and stamped by the municipal court an hour ago. The blind trust had retroactively assumed control of all corporate lease agreements. I instructed Wallace to execute the immediate cancellation of the penthouse contract citing gross financial misconduct and fraudulent occupancy. The building superintendent was a pragmatic man who prioritized lucrative corporate contracts over the personal feelings of his tenants. When Wallace presented the termination notice and guaranteed a hefty termination fee paid directly from the trust, the superintendent was more than willing to cooperate. I opened a secondary application on my tablet. 10 minutes earlier, I had used my administrative access to tap into the building security mainframe. The screen flickered to life, displaying a grid of high-resolution camera feeds from the lobby, the private elevators, and the 42nd floor corridor. I watched the live feed with cold detachment. A black town car abruptly pulled into the circular driveway of the building. The doors opened, and Leo stepped out onto the wet pavement. He looked haggard and completely unraveled. The polished arrogance he had worn at the gala was entirely stripped away. Melanie followed closely behind him. Her posture was rigid with suppressed fury. They did not speak to each other as they crossed the marble lobby. They walked past the concierge desk without offering their usual entitled greetings. They stepped into the private elevator and the doors slid shut. I switched the camera feed on my tablet to the penthouse corridor. The elevator arrived, and they stepped out onto the plush carpet. Melanie marched ahead of Leo and reached into her designer handbag for her electronic key fob. She pressed the small plastic device against the digital sensor embedded in the mahogany door. A sharp red light blinked rapidly on the keypad. The heavy deadbolt did not retract. Melanie frowned and pressed the fob against the sensor a second time. The red light flashed again, accompanied by a harsh negative tone. She turned to Leo and demanded to know why the system was malfunctioning. Leo stepped forward and pulled his own key fob from his pocket. He swiped it across the sensor with an impatient, aggressive motion. The keypad denied him entry. Before Leo could strike the door, the elevator chimed behind them. The doors parted and the building superintendent stepped out into the hallway. He was not alone. Two massive private security contractors flanked him. The guards wore tactical vests and stood with their hands resting near their utility belts. Leo turned around with a look of absolute bewilderment. He demanded that the superintendent unlock the door immediately and threatened to have him fired for the inconvenience. The superintendent did not flinch or offer an apology. He stepped forward and handed Leo a thick legal document secured in a heavy manila folder. The superintendent spoke in a calm and detached voice. The audio feed from the hallway camera transmitted his words perfectly into the cab of my truck. He informed Leo that the corporate lease guaranteeing the penthouse had been permanently terminated by the holding company. He stated that the eviction was immediate and non-negotiable. He explained that all personal belongings currently inside the suite had been impounded pending a federal financial investigation into corporate fraud. Leo stared at the paper in his hands. His eyes scanned the legal jargon and the undeniable signature of a municipal judge. He stammered that this was a mistake and that he was the incoming chief executive officer of the company. The superintendent simply shook his head. He told Leo that his access to the building was permanently revoked and that the security team was there to escort them off the premises immediately. If they refused to leave voluntarily, the police would be called to arrest them for trespassing. Melanie snatched the document from Leo and read the termination clause. The reality of her situation hit her with devastating force. The luxurious life she had married into was completely gone. She had no car and no money, and now she had no home. She turned to Leo with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. She threw the legal document directly at his chest. She screamed that he was a pathetic failure who had ruined everything. She completely lost any remaining shred of composure. She yelled that she refused to sleep on the street because he was too incompetent to handle a senile old man. She demanded that he access the hidden cash he kept in the safe deposit box downtown. She ordered him to go to the vault right now and retrieve the money so they could flee the city before the federal authorities issued warrants for their arrest. Leo stood perfectly still in the center of the hallway. The blood drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly gray. I watched the exact moment his mind processed the fatal flaw in her demand. Melanie had screamed about the hidden vault. She had told me about the safe deposit box during her hysterical breakdown in my study. Leo slowly turned his head to look at his wife. He realized the catastrophic magnitude of her mistake. If I knew about the vault, I had undoubtedly accessed it. If I had accessed the vault, I had found the charred watch and the maritime logbook. I knew about the embezzled funds, and I knew about the deliberate assassination attempt on the yacht 15 years ago. The entire foundation of his existence crumbled in a matter of seconds. I was not a confused old man reacting to a financial dispute. I was a grieving father who had just uncovered the murder of his own son. Leo understood that there was no negotiation left. There were no more legal maneuvers to play. I knew everything. The security guards stepped forward and instructed them to move toward the elevator. Leo did not argue. He walked onto the elevator in total silence, dragging Melanie along by the arm. I switched the camera feed back to the lobby. They emerged from the building and stood on the sidewalk. Melanie was crying hysterically while wrapping her arms around her chest. Leo ignored her completely. He pulled his encrypted secondary phone from his pocket. He dialed a number and pressed the device to his ear. I rolled down the window of my truck, just enough to hear his voice carry across the wet street. His tone was no longer panicked or desperate. It was devoid of all humanity. It was the voice of a cornered predator making its final play for survival. He spoke to the men on the other end of the line. He told his hired enforcers that the extraction plan was canceled. The objective was no longer to extort a signature or secure financial leverage. He ordered them to bypass the city and head directly to the northern coastal inlet. He gave them a singular lethal directive. He told them to find the man living in the fisherman cabin and eliminate him immediately. He commanded them to burn the structure to the ground and leave no witnesses breathing. I rolled up the window of my truck and dropped the vehicle into drive. Leo had officially shifted his goal to outright murder. He was sending a heavily armed kill squad to finish the job he started a decade and a half ago. The legal destruction of his life was complete, but the physical war was just beginning. I pressed my foot down on the accelerator and pulled away from the curb. I left Leo and Melanie standing on the sidewalk with absolutely nothing to their names. I merged onto the northbound highway and pushed the engine toward its maximum limit. I had to reach that remote coastal town before those enforcers arrived. I had to rip my son from the crosshairs of a ruthless syndicate and end this nightmare permanently. The miles stretched out before me as the rain began to fall once again. The coastal highway twisted northward like a gray ribbon cutting through dense pine forests and jagged rock formations. Rain battered the windshield of the truck. The wipers worked frantically to clear the deluge. I pushed the engine hard against the steep inclines, the air growing colder and heavy with the scent of salt and decaying seaweed. 300 miles separated the city from the coordinates listed on the back of the surveillance photograph. Every mile marker passing by felt like a ticking clock counting down the seconds to my son's execution. The roads became narrower as the commercial districts faded into abandoned fishing outposts. Fog rolled off the churning ocean and swallowed the coastline. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. The heater blasted warm air into the cabin, but a profound chill had settled deep into my bones. I finally spotted the turnoff hidden behind a cluster of overgrown spruce trees. The tires crunched over a gravel path that descended sharply toward a secluded inlet. The furious ocean crashed against towering sea stacks. The sound was deafening. It was a roar of water and wind that masked my approach. At the end of the narrow path sat the battered wooden cabin from the photograph. It was a miserable structure, built from weathered timber and rusted corrugated iron. It clung to the edge of the cliff as if bracing against the inevitable collapse into the sea. I parked the truck behind a thick thicket of bushes and turned off the engine. I stepped out into the freezing rain. I did not walk up the front path. I circled the perimeter, keeping my silhouette hidden against the tree line. The isolation of the inlet provided the perfect cover for a murder. No neighbors existed to hear screams. No passing patrols would notice a fire. I crept toward the side window. The glass was shattered. Shards glittered on the wet grass like broken diamonds. I moved to the front porch. The heavy wooden door hung loosely from a single bent hinge. Splintered wood surrounded the deadbolt. Someone had kicked the door in with massive force. Muddy boot prints stamped the porch planks. They were fresh. The rainwater had not yet washed the dirt away. Leo had moved his enforcers with terrifying speed. I pulled a heavy steel wrench from my coat pocket. It was the only weapon I had grabbed from the truck toolbox. I stepped over the threshold and entered the dark cabin. The interior was completely demolished. Chairs were smashed against the walls. A wooden dining table was flipped over with its legs snapped in half. Books and nautical charts littered the floor. The smell of overturned kerosene and copper hung thick in the damp air. I scanned the shadows. The cabin consisted of a single main room and a tiny connected bedroom. I moved silently toward the bedroom doorway, gripping the wrench tightly. The floorboards groaned under my weight. I stepped into the bedroom. A sudden violent force slammed into my side. A heavy shoulder drove into my ribs. The impact knocked the breath from my lungs and sent me crashing against the opposite wall. The steel wrench flew from my hand and clattered across the wooden floor. Before I could recover, a massive figure tackled me to the ground. Thick, calloused hands wrapped around my throat. Thumbs pressed deeply into my windpipe, cutting off my oxygen. I thrashed wildly, trying to buck the attacker off my chest. I drove my knee upward, but the man shifted his weight with practiced ease and pinned my legs. The dim light from his broken window illuminated the face of my attacker. It was not a syndicate enforcer. It was Jonah. The grizzled dockworker from the city harbor stared down at me with pure adrenaline fueling his actions. He raised a heavy brass pipe, preparing to strike a lethal blow to my skull. I choked out a desperate gasp, fighting for a single breath of air. Jonah stopped mid-swing. His eyes widened in absolute shock. He released his grip on my throat. and stumbled backward, knocking over a bedside lamp. He breathed heavily and lowered the brass pipe. He stared at me as I rolled onto my side, coughing violently and pulling air back into my burning lungs. Jonah shook his head and ran a trembling hand over his face. He pulled me up from the floor by my jacket collar. He did not ask how I had found the inlet. He simply stated that I should not be here. He explained that he had spotted the black sport utility vehicle pulling onto the gravel path 20 minutes ago. 2 armed men had exited the vehicle and marched straight for the front porch. Jonah quickly detailed his involvement. He had worked on the docks for 30 years. He had known Cameron since my son was a teenager, learning the logistics trade. When Cameron survived the yacht fire 15 years ago, he had dragged himself onto a remote beach with horrific burns. Jonah had found him. Jonah had hidden him. He had smuggled medical supplies to the coast and provided Cameron with the fake identity needed to disappear. Jonah had served as the sole contact between my son and the outside world, watching the harbor while Cameron healed in exile. I demanded to know where my son was hiding right now. Jonah opened his mouth to speak, but a sharp, metallic click echoed from the main room. We both froze. The sound of a tactical rifle being cocked was unmistakable. Heavy footsteps approached the bedroom doorway. The second enforcer had returned from scouting the perimeter of the cliff. A tall man stepped into the doorframe. He wore black tactical gear and held a suppressed automatic rifle leveled directly at my chest. Rainwater dripped from his combat helmet. His eyes were cold and devoid of any hesitation. He raised the barrel, aiming for a clean headshot. I stood completely still. I knew I could not dodge a bullet at this range. Jonah moved with explosive speed. He threw the heavy brass pipe directly at the enforcer's face. The metal cylinder struck the man right above the bridge of his nose. The enforcer grunted and stumbled backward. The rifle fired a suppressed shot into the ceiling plaster. I lunged forward before the gunman could correct his aim. I tackled him around the waist, driving my shoulder into his armored stomach. The sheer momentum carried us both out of the bedroom and into the demolished main room. We crashed into the overturned dining table. The rifle slipped from his grasp and slid across the floorboards. The enforcer recovered instantly. He drew a serrated combat knife from his belt and slashed horizontally toward my neck. I leaned back narrowly, avoiding the lethal blade. The sharp steel sliced through the fabric of my coat. The man stepped forward to deliver a fatal thrust. Jonah charged from the bedroom and slammed a wooden chair leg into the back of the enforcer's knees. The man buckled and dropped to one knee. I stepped inside his guard and delivered a brutal knee strike to his jaw. The impact snapped his head backward. Jonah followed up with a vicious right hook that sent the mercenary crashing onto the floor unconscious. We stood over the neutralized threat, breathing heavily in the quiet cabin. The rain continued to hammer against the tin roof. I turned to Jonah. My voice was hoarse and desperate. I asked him again to tell me where Cameron was hiding. I told him we needed to extract my son before Leo sent a second tactical team to the inlet. Jonah looked at me with profound sorrow. The adrenaline faded from his eyes, leaving only a deep, hollow exhaustion. He shook his head slowly. He explained that Cameron was not hiding in the woods or waiting in a backup safe house. Jonah told me that Cameron had monitored the syndicate communications using a hacked radio frequency. My son had intercepted the transmission detailing my financial assault on Leo. Cameron realized that I was alive and fighting a corporate war on his behalf. He also realized that Leo was cornered and highly volatile. Jonah grabbed my shoulder. His grip was painfully tight. He delivered the final, crushing revelation. Cameron had seen the enforcers approaching the inlet on the security cameras earlier this morning. My son knew he could not outrun a mobilized syndicate hit squad forever. He knew Leo would never stop hunting him and would inevitably murder me to secure the remaining trust assets. Cameron had made a unilateral decision. He had slipped out the back door of the cabin hours before the enforcers breached the front porch. He took a stolen skiff and navigated the coastal waters, heading straight back to the city harbor. Jonah looked me dead in the eyes. He told me that Cameron had gone back to surrender. My son was walking directly into the center of the syndicate operation to hand himself over to Leo. Cameron intended to offer his own life in a final trade to guarantee my absolute safety. He was going to let Leo kill him to end the 15-year war. The realization slammed into my chest with agonizing force. I had driven 300 miles to save my son, only to discover he was currently walking back into the very slaughterhouse I had just escaped. I looked down at the unconscious mercenary. I stepped over him and walked out into the freezing rain. I had to go back to the city. I had to return to the harbor and tear the docks apart. The highway melted into the industrial sprawl of the city as I drove the truck toward the harbor district. The rain came down in solid sheets, turning the asphalt into a black mirror that reflected the sparse streetlights. I tore through the deserted streets with singular focus. The towering cranes of Pier 4 loomed against the stormy night sky like giant metal skeletons. The severe storm had driven every dockworker and security guard indoors. The entire maritime logistics center was completely abandoned, shrouded in darkness and driving rain. The heavy tires of my vehicle splashed through deep puddles as I navigated the maze of stacked shipping containers. The headlights illuminated a black luxury sedan parked aggressively near the edge of the main loading dock. The engine was still running. Exhaust fumes plumed into the freezing rain and vanished into the wind. I killed the headlights and parked my truck behind a wall of rusted freight crates. I stepped out into the deluge. The wind howled off the ocean, carrying the bitter scent of diesel fuel and rotting kelp. I walked toward the loading dock with measured steps. The rain soaked through my coat immediately, but I ignored the biting cold. Every muscle in my body was tight with absolute focus. The sound of crashing waves masked my approach as I closed the distance to the edge of the pier. A harsh halogen spotlight illuminated the wooden planks of the loading dock. Underneath that blinding white glare stood 3 figures. 2 men wearing heavy tactical gear held assault rifles at their sides. They flanked a central figure. Leo stood with his back to the raging ocean. He wore a dark raincoat, completely soaked, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated desperation. Kneeling on the wet wood at his feet was a man. His hands were bound tightly behind his back, with thick industrial zip ties. His clothes were torn and covered in mud from a recent struggle. His face was bruised and bleeding from a fresh laceration across his cheek. The jagged burn scar on his neck stood out starkly against his pale skin. It was Cameron. My son was alive. He was breathing heavily, his head bowed against the driving rain, but his posture remained unbroken. He looked up, his eyes scanning the darkness, searching for a threat. He did not look like a victim. He looked like a man who had accepted his fate to protect his family. Leo held a heavy-caliber pistol aimed directly at the back of Cameron's head. I stepped out from the shadow of the shipping containers and walked directly into the harsh pool of halogen light. I kept my hands empty and visible by my sides. The armed mercenaries instantly raised their rifles and locked their sights onto my chest. Leo turned his head sharply. A perverse smile broke across his panicked features when he saw me. He shouted over the roar of the storm, mocking my arrival. He stated that the grand reunion had finally happened. He grabbed Cameron by the collar of his soaked shirt and yanked him upward, pressing the barrel of the pistol hard against his temple. Leo declared that the games were completely over. He demanded the immediate transfer of the blind trust assets into the offshore syndicate accounts. He gave me a single minute to authorize the release of the $30 million. He promised that if I hesitated, he would execute Cameron right in front of me and finish the job he had botched 15 years ago on the yacht. He screamed that he had nothing left to lose. He claimed the syndicate was going to kill him anyway, so he would gladly take my only son down with him. I stopped walking when I was 10 feet away from the barrel of the gun. I looked at Cameron. For a brief second, 15 years of agonizing grief vanished, replaced by an overwhelming surge of paternal pride. My son met my gaze and gave a slow, imperceptible nod. He was ready to die, but I was not going to let that happen. I returned my attention to Leo. I did not beg for my son's life. I did not attempt to negotiate or offer a compromise. I reached slowly into the inside pocket of my ruined coat. The mercenaries tightened their grips on their rifles, anticipating a weapon. I pulled out a heavy-duty waterproof tablet. The screen was illuminated, displaying a grid of complex data and a live video feed. I tossed the device through the rain. It landed with a loud smack on the wet wooden planks, sliding exactly to the tips of Leo's expensive leather shoes. Leo looked down at the glowing screen in confusion. I spoke with a voice completely devoid of fear or emotion, projecting my words clearly over the roaring wind. I informed Leo that the tablet was currently maintaining a secure encrypted live stream. I told him to look closely at the active participants on the call. The men watching this confrontation in real time were not federal agents or police investigators. They were the executive members of the international syndicate, the same men who had been relentlessly demanding their laundered money for the past 6 hours. I explained that I had not just locked the accounts to ruin his corporate standing. I had used Sylvia's forensic accounting to trace every single transaction he had made over the past 5 years. I had compiled a complete, undeniable dossier proving that Leo had been systematically skimming millions of dollars off the top of the syndicate's laundered cash. He had diverted their clean money into his own private offshore funds to finance his lavish lifestyle and cover his personal gambling debts. The tablet was currently broadcasting the entire dossier, line by line, directly to his ruthless creditors. The color drained entirely from Leo's face. The arrogant sneer vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, paralyzing terror. He stared at the waterproof tablet resting on the wet pier as if it were a live explosive. He understood instantly that his threat against Cameron was completely neutralized. The syndicate did not care about my son or the logistics company anymore. They only cared about the fact that their trusted launderer had been stealing from them for years. The dynamics of the harbor standoff shifted with violent speed. The 2 armed mercenaries standing beside Leo lowered their rifles. They were not loyal to Leo. They were hired contractors paid by the syndicate to ensure the recovery of the funds. They heard my explanation and saw the digital proof displayed on the screen. The mercenary on the right reached down and picked up the tablet. He examined the active live stream and the scrolling financial documents. He looked at the camera lens and gave a brief, acknowledging nod to the men watching from the other side of the world. The mercenary turned his gaze toward Leo. The weapon previously aimed at me was now leveled directly at Leo's chest. The second enforcer mirrored the movement, stepping away from Cameron and boxing Leo in against the edge of the pier. Leo dropped the pistol. The weapon clattered harmlessly against the wooden planks. He raised his hands in a frantic gesture of surrender, babbling incoherent excuses to the men holding him at gunpoint. He begged them to understand that it was a temporary loan and that he was going to pay the syndicate back with the corporate buyout money. The mercenaries remained completely silent. They were waiting for a final directive from the tablet. The screen flashed with a new incoming command from the syndicate bosses. The mercenary holding the device read the text and slipped the tablet into his tactical vest. The new conflict was absolute and undeniable. Leo was no longer the predator holding the cards. He was the prey, marked for immediate execution by his own employers. The glowing screen of the waterproof tablet illuminated the harsh driving rain with a cold, artificial light. The 2 heavily armored mercenaries stepped closer to the device resting on the wet wooden planks. Water cascaded off their dark tactical helmets as they stared down at the scrolling digital ledgers. The numbers highlighted in bright crimson text painted a flawless, undeniable picture of systematic theft. The lead enforcer dropped to one knee. He traced the glass screen with a thick, gloved finger. He expertly cross-referenced the hidden offshore accounts with the syndicate capital they had been hired to retrieve. Vincent stood perfectly still in the center of the downpour. He let the raw financial data dismantle a 15-year empire of lies. He knew the criminals looking at that tablet understood exactly what those routing numbers meant. The mercenary realized the catastrophic magnitude of the deception in absolute silence. Leo had skimmed millions of dollars from the international syndicate over the span of a decade. He had funneled their laundered cash into dummy corporations registered under his own personal holding companies. The enforcer stood up slowly. He locked eyes with his armed partner. A silent, universal agreement passed between the two men. They were lethal contractors paid highly to protect the organization, and the man they were currently guarding was the organization's greatest parasite. The loyalty bought by Leo evaporated instantly into the freezing ocean air. The tactical rifles previously lowered toward the ground slowly began to rise. They pivoted away from Vincent and locked directly onto a new target. Leo watched the synchronized movement of the heavy assault rifles. The blood completely washed out of his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale white beneath the blinding halogen docklights. He understood the absolute finality of the shift in their posture. The carefully constructed narrative of his corporate superiority shattered against the reality of the digital proof. He was a dead man walking on a lonely pier. Pure, unadulterated panic flooded his nervous system. He let out a primal, guttural scream of absolute fury. It was a sound entirely devoid of strategy or executive refinement. It was the desperate noise of a cornered animal realizing the trap had permanently snapped shut. He raised the heavy-caliber pistol he had previously dropped. His arm trembled violently against the raging wind. He leveled the iron sights directly at Vincent. If his life was going to end on this miserable coastal dock, he was determined to drag the architect of his destruction down into the abyss with him. He tightened his grip on the weapon. His finger curled around the metallic curve of the trigger. The mercenaries reacted with terrifying, brutal efficiency. Before Leo could compress the trigger mechanism, the lead enforcer stepped entirely inside his firing arc. The thug swung the heavy synthetic stock of his assault rifle upward in a smooth, vicious arc. The weapon connected with devastating force against the underside of Leo's right wrist. The sharp crack of fracturing bone echoed cleanly over the roaring surf. Leo released a high-pitched shriek of absolute agony. The pistol flew from his shattered grip. It skittered across the slippery wooden dock and splashed into a deep puddle near the edge of the pier. The second mercenary moved simultaneously with his partner. He swept his heavy combat boot hard behind Leo's knees. The impact collapsed the executive's legs completely. Leo hit the wet wooden planks face first with a sickening thud. The lead enforcer drove a knee, the size of a cinder block, directly into the center of Leo's spine. The immense weight pinned the broken man flat against the rotting wood. The enforcer yanked Leo's arms backward, twisting the fractured wrist without an ounce of mercy. He secured Leo's hands with a thick, industrial zip tie, pulled tight enough to cut off the circulation. The entire violent process took less than 5 seconds. It was a flawless mechanical extraction performed by men who delivered syndicate justice for a living. Leo thrashed wildly on the ground. He spit blood and rainwater onto the planks. He pleaded incoherently for a second chance. He promised he could retrieve the stolen funds immediately. He begged the silent men to let him contact his offshore bankers to reverse the transfers. The mercenaries completely ignored his pathetic negotiations. They hauled him upward by the shoulders of his ruined designer raincoat. His expensive Italian shoes dragged uselessly across the wet dock as they hauled him toward the idling black sport utility vehicle. The rear passenger door opened wide. It swallowed the weeping executive into the dark interior. The heavy steel door slammed shut. It sealed Leo's fate permanently. The vehicle accelerated sharply. Its tires gripped the wet asphalt, speeding away from the pier and vanishing into the coastal storm. The mastermind behind 15 years of misery had been entirely neutralized by his own boundless greed. Vincent exhaled a long, steady breath. He felt the crushing weight of a decade and a half lift from his tired shoulders. He walked forward through the torrential rain, moving directly toward the kneeling figure of his son. Cameron remained bound on the wet wood. His breathing was shallow and ragged. His face was badly battered and bruised from the intense physical struggle that occurred before my arrival. Vincent dropped to his knees on the soaked planks beside his boy. He pulled a sharp folding knife from his heavy coat pocket. He sliced cleanly through the thick plastic zip ties binding Cameron's wrists. He reached out and grabbed his son tightly by the shoulders. He pulled him into a fierce, desperate embrace. Cameron gripped his father with equal intensity. His body shook from the freezing cold and the residual adrenaline of facing a firing squad. The reunion was silent and powerful. It was forged in the relentless fire of their mutual survival. Vincent placed a hand on the back of Cameron's head, feeling the damp hair and the reality of his living, breathing child. He helped Cameron to his feet. He wrapped a strong arm around his son's waist to steady his battered and exhausted frame. The violent chapter had finally concluded. They simply needed to walk back to the hidden truck and leave this cursed harbor behind them forever. They took their first slow step toward freedom. A sharp scrape of hard leather against wet wood broke the steady rhythm of the crashing waves. A dark silhouette detached itself from the deep shadows of the stacked shipping containers near the edge of the pier. Vincent instinctively pushed Cameron firmly behind his own body. He turned squarely to face the new anomaly emerging from the darkness. The figure stepped out into the bright periphery of the harsh halogen spotlight. It was Melanie. Her custom designer dress was plastered completely to her skin by the freezing rain. Her expensive high heels were entirely ruined. They were caked in thick mud from navigating the industrial harbor terrain on foot. She had tracked Leo's vehicle from the penthouse eviction. She was desperate to secure her own survival. She had hoped to intercept whatever hidden cash he managed to extract from the chaotic standoff. Her face was contorted into a terrifying mask of pure, absolute madness. The elegant, poised socialite was completely gone. In her place stood a woman who had just watched her entire fraudulent kingdom disintegrate into ash. She raised her shaking hands directly into the blinding light. She was gripping a stolen firearm. It was the same heavy-caliber pistol Leo had dropped during his brutal arrest. She had retrieved the weapon from the muddy puddle on the dock while the men were distracted. Her manicured fingers were wrapped dangerously tight around the wet grip. The barrel trembled slightly, but remained locked precisely on Cameron's chest. Melanie screamed over the roaring wind. Her voice was shrill and dripping with toxic venom. She blamed Cameron for everything. She shrieked that her life was absolutely flawless before he resurrected himself from the dead. She accused him of deliberately destroying the corporate empire she had sacrificed her entire youth to build. She yelled that she refused to go back to being nothing. The rain poured heavily down her face. It washed away her expensive makeup, revealing the raw, unhinged monster show lurking just beneath the surface. She pulled the heavy steel hammer back on the pistol with a sharp, lethal click. The metal weapon was fully primed and ready to fire. The nightmare was not completely over. It had simply changed faces. I moved without conscious thought. The space between the trembling barrel of the stolen pistol and my son vanished as I stepped directly into the line of fire. I positioned my body as a solid physical barrier between the weapon and Cameron. The heavy downpour plastered my wool coat to my shoulders, and the freezing rain stung my face. My focus remained entirely locked on the woman holding the firearm. Melanie stood 10 feet away looking like a shattered porcelain doll. Her custom designer dress was completely ruined and clinging to her shivering frame. Her expensive shoes were caked in thick harbor mud. Her eyes were widely dilated with absolute panic and severe sleep deprivation. She was operating purely on the erratic adrenaline of a cornered animal whose entire reality had just been dismantled. A firearm in the hands of a trained professional is a predictable threat. A firearm in the hands of a terrified socialite who has just lost her fabricated empire is a chaotic and highly volatile variable. I kept my hands visible and my posture entirely relaxed. Showing any sudden aggression would trigger her frantic fight or flight response. Showing any physical weakness would invite a fatal mistake. I needed to dismantle her remaining resolve using the only language she truly understood. I needed to speak to her in terms of cold, calculated self-interest and absolute legal reality. I spoke in a low, resonant tone that carried easily over the crashing ocean waves and the howling wind. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of fear. I instructed her to consider her next physical movement with extreme precision. I informed her that she was currently holding a stolen weapon that had just been handled by an operative of an international crime syndicate. I explained that discharging that specific firearm would instantly tie her to a vast network of organized violence and guarantee her involvement in a federal racketeering investigation. Melanie gripped the wet metal grip tighter. She screamed that her life was already over and that she had absolutely nothing left to lose. I corrected her immediately. I laid out the stark reality of her current legal situation with icy detachment. I detailed the exact nature of the federal wire fraud she had committed by forging my signature on the massive corporate pension loan. I explained that white-collar financial crime carried a very specific and manageable set of consequences. She would face a federal indictment and a lengthy trial. She would undoubtedly serve time in a minimum security correctional facility designed for corporate offenders. She would lose her luxury vehicles, and she had already lost her penthouse suite. I told her that losing her wealth was the absolute best-case scenario currently waiting for her if she chose to lower the weapon. I let that truth sink deep into her panicked mind. I watched her breath hitch as the concrete reality of a prison cell materialized in her racing thoughts. Then I outlined the alternative path. I told her to look directly at my chest and to think about the physical mechanics of pulling that trigger. I explained that if she fired that weapon, she would instantly elevate her crimes from corporate financial fraud to premeditated capital murder. I told her that state prosecutors do not offer generous plea deals for the execution of an unarmed elderly man on a public pier. I detailed the severe contrast between a finite sentence in a federal camp and spending the rest of her natural life behind bars in a maximum security state penitentiary without the possibility of parole. I reminded her that the forged loan documents sitting securely in my desk drawer had her pristine fingerprints stamped all over them. The digital trail of the embezzled funds led directly to a private shell account registered under her own maiden name. The district attorney would build an airtight narrative of a greedy daughter-in-law murdering her wealthy father-in-law to silence an active fraud investigation. She would be painted to the media as a ruthless killer. She would never wear designer clothes or walk free in civilian society ever again. I presented these two diverging paths of her life with absolute emotional detachment. I told her she had 5 seconds to choose between temporary financial ruin and permanent physical destruction. The psychological pressure in the damp air was entirely suffocating. Melanie stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. Her lower lip trembled violently as she tried to process the insurmountable weight of my words. She attempted to formulate a response, but her vocal cords simply failed to produce a sound. She looked down at the heavy pistol in her hands, as if she suddenly realized the true gravity of what she was holding. The fragile illusion of her control evaporated into the storm. Right at that exact moment, a shrill wailing sound pierced the heavy coastal rain. The noise echoed off the towering steel shipping containers and rolled across the dark harbor waters. It was the unmistakable sound of multiple police sirens approaching the loading docks. I had instructed Wallace to alert the local precinct the moment the syndicate enforcers arrived at the pier. The authorities were converging on our specific location with rapid speed. The flashing red and blue lights began to paint the low-hanging clouds in the distance. The approaching sirens broke the final thread of her sanity. Melanie realized her time had completely run out. The authorities were mere seconds away. She had no escape vehicle and no hidden funds to finance a flight from justice. She was utterly trapped on a freezing pier, holding a stolen weapon. The physical toll of this realization hit her central nervous system instantly. Her knees buckled beneath her ruined dress. The heavy pistol slipped from her numb fingers and clattered harmlessly onto the wet wooden planks. She collapsed entirely onto the slick surface of the loading dock. She pulled her knees to her chest and began to sob with loud, gasping breaths. She buried her face in her muddy hands. The immediate threat to my son was completely neutralized. She was no longer a dangerous variable holding a gun. She was just a broken shell of a desperate woman waiting to be handcuffed by the approaching officers. I kicked the discarded firearm across the dock, so it splashed deeply into the dark ocean water below. I turned my back on the sobbing woman and looked at the man standing directly behind me. Cameron stood tall against the driving rain. His face was covered in fresh bruising and deep lacerations from his brutal struggle with the syndicate operatives, but his eyes were bright and incredibly sharp. 15 years of agonizing phantom grief washed out of my body in a single rushing tide. I stepped forward and wrapped my arms around his broad shoulders. I pulled my son into a fierce embrace that defied the passage of time and the cruelty of the lies we had endured. Cameron gripped my coat with crushing strength. We did not exchange tearful apologies or dramatic declarations in the rain. The profound, solid reality of his physical presence was entirely enough. I felt the steady beat of his heart against my chest. I felt the powerful grip of a man who had survived an inferno and a decade and a half of silent exile. My son was finally home. We stepped back from the embrace just as the first police cruiser skidded onto the gravel lot at the edge of the pier. The tires threw a massive spray of muddy water into the air. The heavy doors flew open and uniformed officers poured out to secure the scene. The immediate physical violence was over, but the logistical nightmare of our survival was just beginning to take shape. I looked at Cameron and recognized the monumental legal task ahead of us. My son was legally classified as a deceased person. A formal death certificate had been filed and executed by the state 15 years ago. He possessed no valid identification, no social security number, and no legal standing in the eyes of the government. He was a ghost standing in the pouring rain. Beyond the personal legal resurrection, we faced a catastrophic corporate crisis. Cross-marine logistics was in absolute ruins. Leo had infected the operational infrastructure with syndicate laundering protocols and massive unapproved debts. The company reputation was severely compromised, and the remaining assets were currently locked inside my impenetrable blind trust. We had a remarkably narrow window to act. We needed to untangle the massive legal web surrounding his fake death before the financial media caught wind of the resurrection. We needed to coordinate with Wallace to build an airtight legal shield, protecting Cameron from any lingering syndicate retaliation or police inquiries. We had to prepare exhaustive statements for the federal authorities regarding the wire fraud, the attempted murder, and the offshore accounts. I placed a firm hand on Cameron's shoulder and guided him toward my hidden truck. We had to navigate the police barricade, secure a private sanctuary, and begin drafting the total reclamation of our lives before the sun crested over the horizon. The war for survival had concluded, but the brutal campaign to rebuild our family legacy commenced immediately. The wail of the sirens grew deafening as a massive fleet of federal cruisers breached the perimeter of the harbor. Red and blue lights painted the wet shipping containers in frantic sweeping strokes. Heavily armed tactical units poured out of the vehicles and swarmed the loading dock. They moved with absolute precision and overwhelming force. 2 officers immediately flanked the sobbing figure of Melanie on the wooden planks. She did not resist the authorities. She offered no excuses and no manic denials to the federal agents. The absolute reality of her bleak situation had completely crushed her spirit. A federal agent read her Miranda rights in a loud, clear voice while another secured her wrists in heavy steel handcuffs. The cold metal locked into place with a sharp, definitive click over the roaring wind. They hoisted her to her feet and marched her toward a waiting armored transport van. Her ruined designer gown dragged through the oily puddles covering the dock. She looked over her shoulder one last time toward the ambulance. Her eyes sought mine, but I offered no pity and no forgiveness for the woman who had plotted to destroy my family. The heavy steel doors of the van slammed shut, securing her inside the dark cabin. She was officially a federal prisoner facing a mountain of insurmountable evidence for corporate wire fraud and the attempted murder of my only son. The coordinated federal sweep did not stop at the docks. A secondary tactical unit had already established a hard perimeter at the main commercial gate of the port. The radio on the lead agent's shoulder crackled to life with a priority update. The dispatch reported a successful high-risk interception on the Coastal Access Highway. The black sport utility vehicle carrying Leo and the syndicate enforcers had been forcibly stopped by a barricade of armored federal trucks. The syndicate mercenaries had surrendered immediately upon recognizing the overwhelming federal presence. They were seasoned professionals who knew when a lucrative contract was permanently void. Leo was dragged from the back seat of the vehicle by federal marshals. The brutal street justice he was about to suffer at the hands of his criminal employers had been interrupted. Instead, he was being handed directly over to the United States justice system. The lead detective standing on the loading dock confirmed the high-profile arrest over his radio network. He stated that Leo was currently being transported to the Central Federal Holding Facility under maximum security. He was being booked on extensive charges of corporate embezzlement, federal wire fraud conspiracy to commit capital murder, and international money laundering. The syndicate bosses would undoubtedly sever all ties with him, leaving him entirely exposed to the full wrath of the federal prosecutors. There would be no bail and no lenient plea agreements for the man who orchestrated a 15-year nightmare. An emergency medical unit arrived and parked near the edge of the pier. Paramedics wrapped Cameron in a thick thermal blanket and guided him into the back of the illuminated ambulance. I sat on the narrow bench beside my son as a trauma medic carefully treated the deep lacerations on his face and evaluated his bruised ribs. The warm air of the medical bay slowly drove the freezing coastal chill from our exhausted bones. Footsteps approached the open rear doors of the ambulance. Wallace and Sylvia emerged from the stormy darkness accompanied by the lead federal investigator. My attorney and my forensic accountant had coordinated the entire federal response while I was driving to the northern inlet. Wallace carried a heavy waterproof briefcase. He set it down on the metal floor of the ambulance. He informed the detective that the briefcase contained the absolute totality of the evidence we had gathered over the past 72 hours. I reached into my coat and pulled out the charred maritime logbook I had retrieved from the hidden safe deposit box. I handed the burned leather-bound journal directly to the federal investigator. I explained that the fragile pages contained the original maintenance records, proving Leo had deliberately sabotaged the yacht engine 15 years ago. Sylvia then produced a thick stack of printed financial ledgers and a secure encrypted digital drive. She detailed how the drive held every single routing number, offshore shell company, and illegal transaction Leo and Melanie had executed to drain the corporate pension funds. Sylvia explained that the data also included the absolute proof of Leo stealing massive sums from the international laundering syndicate. The detective bagged the logbook and the digital drive in clear tamper-proof evidence containers. He looked at the mountain of undeniable proof resting on the ambulance floor. He assured us that the district attorney would have a pristine, airtight case ready for the grand jury before the end of the current week. Leo and Melanie were going to spend the rest of their natural lives rotting inside a federal penitentiary. The satisfying weight of justice was suddenly interrupted by a new, escalating chaos. A line of bright white satellite vans bypassed the outer police barricade and screeched to a halt near the edge of the harbor lot. The vibrant logos of major financial news networks were plastered across the sides of the vehicles. Dozens of aggressive reporters and camera operators spilled out onto the wet asphalt. They pushed against the yellow police tape, shouting frantic questions into the storm. Someone inside the local precinct had leaked the explosive details of the harbor raid to the press. The media had caught wind of the impossible story unfolding on the docks. The headlines were already being drafted and beamed across digital networks globally. They were reporting that the supposedly deceased heir to the cross-marine logistics empire had been found alive after 15 years. They were broadcasting that the incoming chief executive officer had been arrested for massive corporate fraud and attempted murder. Wallace pulled out his secure smartphone and checked the global market indices. The color drained completely from his face. He turned to me and stated that the international markets in Asia and Europe were reacting violently to the breaking news. The sudden revelation of profound executive corruption and a resurrected heir had thrown the institutional investors into absolute panic. The major shareholders were dumping their stock aggressively, fearing a total corporate collapse. Wallace warned me that when the domestic markets opened at dawn, the stock price of my entire marine logistics company would plummet into an irrecoverable freefall. The corporate empire I had spent 40 years building was on the verge of total financial annihilation within the next few hours. The physical danger to my son had been permanently neutralized, but the ruthless corporate war was demanding my immediate attention. I stood up from the ambulance bench. I looked at Cameron. He was battered and exhausted, but he nodded firmly, understanding the gravity of the new threat. I turned to Wallace and Sylvia. I instructed them to initiate our emergency crisis management protocols immediately. We had to draft a flawless public relations narrative and secure the backing of our most loyal board members before the opening bell rang on Wall Street. I had to step out of the shadows and face the vicious financial media directly. I had to seize the narrative and project absolute unshakable stability to prevent a catastrophic corporate collapse. The rain continued to pour over the harbor as I prepared to fight the most important boardroom battle of my entire existence. The physical violence was finished, but the war for our legacy was just starting. The polished mahogany doors of the 50th floor boardroom stood closed, but they could not contain the chaotic roar echoing from within. It was exactly 8 in the morning, and the pristine corporate sanctuary had devolved into absolute pandemonium. The massive digital screens lining the walls broadcasted the disastrous opening bell on Wall Street. Cross-marine logistics was in a terrifying freefall. Red downward arrows flashed continuously as institutional investors dumped their shares based on the overnight media leaks regarding corporate fraud and a resurrected heir. Wealthy men and women in expensive suits paced the length of the room, shouting into their mobile devices and demanding answers from empty executive chairs. The air was thick with the suffocating stench of financial ruin. They were terrified of losing their fortunes. They were leaderless and desperate. I stood in the quiet marble hallway outside the glass partition, completely ignoring the panic radiating from the boardroom. I adjusted the cuffs of my dark tailored suit. I did not lean heavily on a polished walking cane, and I did not hunch my shoulders to feign the fragile vulnerability of a grieving widow. I stood with the rigid posture of a man who had forged an international logistics empire from nothing. Cameron stood directly beside me. He wore a sharp charcoal suit that perfectly concealed the thick medical bandages wrapping his ribs and shoulders. The tailored fabric gave him an imposing, formidable silhouette. The fresh lacerations on his face and the jagged burn scar on his neck remained fully visible. They were undeniable testaments to his survival and his unyielding resilience. He looked at me with clear, sharp eyes, completely devoid of the hesitation that had plagued him for a decade and a half. We did not exchange any words of encouragement. The time for sentimental family reunions had ended on the docks. We were stepping onto a corporate battlefield. I reached forward and pushed the heavy mahogany doors open with a forceful thrust. The heavy wood crashed against the internal stoppers with a sound like a gunshot. The frantic shouting died instantly. A profound, suffocating silence washed over the entire boardroom. 30 pairs of panicked eyes locked onto the doorway. They stared at me with initial relief that rapidly dissolved into absolute paralyzing shock as their gaze shifted to the man standing at my right side. They recognized Cameron immediately. Despite the passage of 15 years and the physical toll of his exile, the prominent facial structure and the commanding presence of my son were unmistakable. Several board members physically recoiled, stepping back against the leather chairs in sheer disbelief. A few dropped their expensive pens and digital tablets onto the mahogany table. They were looking at a ghost stepping out of a financial nightmare. I did not give them a single second to process their shock or voice their frantic questions. I marched directly to the head of the massive table. My footsteps echoed sharply against the hardwood floor, conveying an absolute ruthless authority. I ordered every single person in the room to take their seats immediately. The command cracked like a whip. Decades of ingrained corporate discipline overrode their astonishment. The wealthy shareholders scrambled to their designated leather chairs, dropping their phones and focusing entirely on me. Cameron took his position, standing stoically right behind my right shoulder, forming an impenetrable united front. I addressed the terrified board of directors with icy, unwavering precision. I laid the unvarnished truth completely bare. I informed them that Leo, their incoming chief executive officer, was currently sitting in a maximum security federal holding cell. I detailed his arrest on the harbor docks exactly 4 hours ago. I explained the overwhelming evidence of his systematic embezzlement, federal wire fraud, and international money laundering. I watched the blood drain entirely from their faces as the reality of Leo stealing millions of dollars from the corporate pension funds washed over them. I stated clearly that the federal authorities possessed the original corrupted ledgers and the offshore routing numbers. The criminal investigation was airtight, and Leo would never step foot inside this building ever again. The quiet murmurs of panic began to ripple through the seated executives as the catastrophic implications of the scandal settled into their minds. They envisioned federal raids plunging stock prices and the total destruction of their individual portfolios. I slammed my open palm flat against the mahogany table. The sharp impact silenced their terrified whispers instantly. I refused to let them surrender to the chaos. I announced a complete and immediate restructuring of the entire executive branch. I fired every single vice president and logistics manager who had been directly appointed by Leo over the past 5 years. I verbally severed the toxic corporate limbs that had allowed the embezzlement to fester. To counter the plummeting stock price and stabilize our hemorrhaging margins, I delivered my financial ultimatum. I revealed the existence of my private offshore trust fund. I informed the board that I was injecting $2.2 million in clean, untraceable liquid cash directly into the corporate operating accounts before the close of business today. I tossed a thick manila folder onto the center of the table containing the verified bank transfers and the legal authorizations. I stated that this massive influx of personal capital would cover all immediate vendor contracts, secure the vulnerable pension funds, and demonstrate absolute unshakable solvency to our institutional investors. I declared that Cross Marine Logistics was not filing for bankruptcy, and we were not surrendering our legacy to the panic of the media. The room remained suspended in a tense, stunned silence until Marcus Thorne pushed his heavy leather chair back and stood up. Thorne was a senior shareholder with silver hair and a notoriously aggressive demeanor. He had been one of Leo's loudest supporters and a frequent critic of my conservative management strategies. He pointed a trembling manicured finger directly at Cameron. He challenged my son's legal capacity and basic competence to assume any leadership role within the company. Thorne cited corporate bylaws with a shrill, desperate voice. He demanded to know how a man who had been legally classified as deceased for 15 years could possibly navigate the complexities of a modern international supply chain. He accused Cameron of being an unstable ghost, completely disconnected from the current economic reality. Thorne rallied the lingering fear in the room, claiming that placing an undocumented, traumatized exile at the helm of the empire would drive the remaining investors away permanently. He insisted that the board needed an experienced emergency interim director to handle the federal crisis. It was a thinly veiled attempt to seize power in the vacuum of Leo's arrest. I did not raise my voice or show a fraction of anger at his brazen rebellion. I slowly opened the leather briefcase sitting on the table in front of me. I pulled out a single thin blue file folder and slid it precisely across the polished mahogany until it stopped inches from Thorne's trembling hands. I spoke with a quiet, lethal calm that resonated in the very bones of every person in the room. I instructed Thorne to open the file and read his own recent financial history aloud to the board. I detailed his disastrous over-leveraged positions in a failing subsidiary port operation in South America. I exposed the hidden bankruptcies he had buried under shell companies to maintain his seat at this table. I revealed that he was currently drowning in millions of dollars of undocumented debt and had repeatedly begged Leo for unauthorized corporate loans to cover his personal margin calls. The color vanished completely from Thorne's face. His mouth opened and closed, but he could not formulate a single word of defense. I told him that his reckless incompetence made him a monumental liability, and his attempt to seize control was a pathetic, desperate joke. I commanded him to sit down and remain entirely silent for the remainder of the meeting, or I would personally hand his fraudulent subsidiary ledgers directly to the federal agents currently tearing through Leo's office. Thorne collapsed back into his leather chair, looking like a physically broken man. He stared blankly at the mahogany table entirely stripped of his power and arrogance. The brutal public dismantling of the loudest dissenter sent a shockwave of absolute submission through the rest of the board. No one else dared to challenge Cameron's return or question my financial directives. The terrified shareholders realized that the era of Leo's weak, easily manipulated management had violently concluded. The true architect of the empire had returned to the throne, and I was bringing my son with me. I pulled out the primary restructuring documents and uncapped my silver fountain pen. I instructed the board secretary to record the immediate instatement of Cameron as the chief operating officer of Cross Marine Logistics. The storm outside battered the thick glass windows of the 50th floor, but the atmosphere inside the boardroom was finally completely secure. The war for the corporate legacy was definitively won. 6 months had passed since the brutal storm washed away the corruption infecting my family legacy. The late afternoon sun hung low over the western horizon, casting a brilliant golden light across the calm waters of Pier 4. I stood at the polished mahogany helm of our newly christened yacht, feeling the gentle rhythmic sway of the hull against the incoming tide. The vessel was a magnificent piece of marine engineering, built with clean lines and a reinforced steel frame. It represented our rebirth and our unwavering commitment to the future. The fresh ocean breeze carried the crisp scent of salt and the promise of uncharted waters. Seagulls circled overhead, tracing lazy patterns in the cloudless sky. I rested my hands on the smooth wooden wheel, allowing the deep vibration of the idling engine to ground me in the present moment. The harbor that once represented a site of near-fatal tragedy had transformed into a sanctuary of absolute peace. The dark shadows of the past were entirely eradicated by the warm evening light. The rhythmic lapping of the waves against the dock provided a soothing melody that replaced the chaotic noise of the corporate battlefield. Cameron stood directly beside me on the spacious deck. He leaned against the stainless steel railing, holding a secure digital tablet. His eyes scanned lines of complex logistical data and international shipping manifests. The deep lacerations on his face had faded into faint pale lines. The severe burn scar on his neck remained visible, but he no longer hid it beneath high collars or shadows. It was a permanent mark of his survival, and he wore it with quiet dignity. He scrolled through the daily operational reports detailing our newly acquired trade routes across the Pacific. He tapped the screen to approve a massive export contract with a legitimate European distributor. The hesitation that had haunted his movements during his 15 years of exile was completely gone. He operated with the sharp, decisive clarity of a seasoned chief executive officer. He was rebuilding the fundamental architecture of our supply chain, ensuring every single container moving through our port was tracked, monitored, and absolutely clean. He had implemented rigorous new inspection protocols that completely eliminated any possibility of illicit cargo entering our facilities. The dock foreman reported directly to him, and their mutual respect formed the bedrock of our new operational standard. I watched my son work with a profound sense of paternal pride. We did not need to speak to understand the magnitude of our shared victory. Our communication had evolved into a seamless professional and personal synergy. When he identified a logistical bottleneck in the Asian markets, he simply pointed to the geographic coordinates on his screen. I immediately authorized the deployment of our reserve cargo ships to alleviate the pressure. We operated as a unified, impenetrable front. The corporate rivals who had anticipated our downfall were now scrambling to secure meager subcontracts under our expanding umbrella. The board of directors operated with absolute transparency and unwavering loyalty. They had witnessed the ruthless efficiency of our restructuring and understood that any deviation from our ethical standards would result in immediate termination. We had forged a corporate culture defined by unbreakable integrity. The executive floor was swept clean of sycophants and replaced with brilliant analytical minds who prioritized sustainable growth over short-term greed. The men and women who had attempted to destroy us were currently experiencing the severe, uncompromising reality of federal justice. Leo was serving his maximum sentence in a maximum security penitentiary located 3 states away. He resided in a cold, concrete cell measuring exactly 6 feet by 8 feet. The man who had previously occupied sprawling penthouse suites now spent 23 hours a day staring at a reinforced steel door. His daily routine consisted of heavily monitored yard time and mandatory manual labor in the prison laundry facility. His custom-tailored suits had been permanently replaced by a coarse, bright orange jumpsuit. The immense wealth he had stolen and hoarded offshore had been entirely seized and repatriated by federal investigators. The international syndicate he once served had completely disavowed him upon his arrest, leaving him without any external protection or financial leverage. He was an isolated, forgotten inmate stripped of his title, his arrogance, and his future. The sterile fluorescent lights of his cell block offered no comfort, and his days bled together in a monotonous cycle of regret and physical exhaustion. Melanie inhabited a similarly bleak reality in a separate federal correctional institution. The socialite who had demanded the keys to my empire was currently assigned to the prison kitchen staff. Her days began before dawn scrubbing industrial aluminum pots and serving tasteless oatmeal to hundreds of other convicted felons. Her designer wardrobe and exclusive country club memberships were distant, evaporated memories. She slept on a thin plastic mattress in a crowded dormitory, listening to the restless coughing of strangers. The intricate web of white-collar fraud she had woven to secure her lavish lifestyle had unraveled completely. The federal prosecutors had meticulously dismantled her forged documents and presented her absolute guilt to a jury that showed zero mercy. She had traded her fraudulent luxury for decades of mandated humility and grueling repetition. She had absolutely nothing left to manipulate. The harsh, repetitive labor calloused her soft hands, and the austere prison environment broke the final fragile remnants of her polished socialite facade. Cross-marine logistics was thriving beyond my most ambitious projections. The initial panic that had gripped the stock market during the early hours of the scandal had vanished within a single week. The immediate injection of my private offshore capital had stabilized the volatile margins perfectly. Institutional investors recognized the brutal swiftness of our internal purge and rewarded our transparency with unprecedented financial backing. Our quarterly profits soared as we finalized legitimate government contracts and expanded our fleet of commercial freighters. The local dock workers and harbor managers respected Cameron implicitly. They saw a man who had walked through literal and figurative fire to protect the integrity of their livelihoods. The company was no longer a fractured entity vulnerable to parasitic executives. It was a towering titan of the maritime industry anchored by truth and propelled by relentless innovation. We had recently acquired 3 new deepwater ports along the eastern seaboard, solidifying our absolute dominance in the logistics sector. I turned my gaze away from the bustling harbor and looked out toward the endless expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. The water shifted from brilliant turquoise to deep indigo as the sun dipped below the skyline. I was no longer the grieving, vulnerable old man that society and my enemies believed me to be. That fabricated persona had served its purpose and was now permanently retired. I had walked through the agonizing fires of deception and emerged as the absolute protector of my bloodline. I had patiently endured the silent humiliations and the calculated thefts while meticulously assembling the instruments of their destruction. The corporate war was over, and the battlefield had been swept completely clean. Cameron lowered his digital tablet and stood beside me, looking out at the same endless horizon. He placed a strong, warm hand on my shoulder. The simple physical contact communicated a volume of gratitude and peace that words could never adequately capture. The engine of the yacht hummed steadily beneath our feet, ready to carry us forward into the coming night. The storm had finally broken. The air was clear, and the future belonged entirely to us. The long, arduous journey had concluded exactly as I had planned from the very beginning. The silent adjustment was complete. True wealth is not measured by the numbers in a hidden bank account or the superficial prestige of a corporate title. Real power lies in patience, unyielding integrity, and the quiet strength to protect those you love. Greed blinds the treacherous, making them underestimate the quiet resilience of a dedicated father. Justice does not always arrive with a loud parade. Sometimes it is a silent, methodical adjustment that completely dismantles corruption and restores the rightful order. Family built on genuine loyalty will always outlast empires built on deceit. If you were captivated by this story of patience and ultimate justice, share your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling tales of redemption.